Good morning and welcome to Live from FM 91, conversation and performance with some of the area's finest musicians and visiting guest artists. We're coming to you from WGTE's Dana Performance Studio today. I'm your host, Brad Cresswell. I'm joined in the studio by Baroque cellist Juliana Soltis, who has made time in her very busy touring schedule right now to stop by the studios here in Toledo. Welcome, Juliana.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so glad that you were able to stop by and share this new album with us. First of all, I want to say, when your first album came out a couple of years ago, it immediately caught my eye because it was called Enter the Devil. And when I first saw it and saw the picture of you, I thought, it was saying something about you, but it was actually a survey of the emergence of the Baroque cello as a solo instrument in 18th century France, right?
Yes.
So now you have followed that up a couple of years later by revisiting probably one of the most sacred cows in all of the cello literature, which are the Bach solo cello suites. You recorded all of these, and the album is called Going Off Script, which kind of gives a clue as to what your approach is for these cello suites. Why don't you give us just a little introduction to this recording and what you're taking on tour with you?
Well, this particular recording, or my recording of the Bach cello suites, tries to get in touch with the performative tradition in which Johann Sebastian Bach, who wrote the suites, worked. And when I say performative tradition, that is a very fancy, I have a whole bunch of degrees way of saying the way that people played things. Yeah. Bach is living and working in a world in which improvisation is a huge part of performing what we call classical music. Classical musicians today, we're taught from a very young age, you play the notes on the page, you follow the instructions that are on the page, that is it. It's a very post-romantic, post-modern way of playing things. It owes a lot to Milton Babbitt, and I do love his essay, Who Cares If You Listen. Right. I certainly recommend it to anybody, but that's not the way that Bach and his contemporaries intended people to interact with the music that they wrote.
So what is it that you're doing that's different from what other cellists have done? I mean, these suites were not all that popular. They were sort of like rediscovered by Pablo Casals when he recorded it in the 30s, right? Mm-hmm. And that became sort of the touchstone, I think, for many cellists, although they branched off in different directions, playing it on different instruments, different arrangements. What is it that you're doing specifically with these cello suites that makes it a different approach from what other cellists do these days?
Well, specifically what I'm doing is I am going in and I am completing Bach's process of composition in the moment of performance by adding these spontaneously improvised little bits. And the word that we use to describe these improvised bits is ornamentation or ornaments. Yeah. Again, spend a whole lot of years in school to learn one fancy word of describing a fairly simple concept. But what I tell people to listen for in performances, and what I hope listeners will be attuned to today, is you'll hear me play something once, and you'll think, oh, how pretty, hopefully. And then you'll be like, oh, wait, didn't I just hear her do that? Is she playing that again? And you are all very, very smart. Because yes, I have taken a repeat and I am playing something again. And it's on this repeat that you want to pay closest attention, because this is when these ornaments, when these spontaneous improvisations happen.
Well, enough talk. Let's do a little music. I know you want to play, start with probably the best known excerpt from the suites. Will you intro this for us?
Oh, this is one of my favorite movements. I think this is probably everybody's favorite movement when it comes to the Bach cello suites. Complete strangers seeing me standing on subway platforms or street corners waiting for that Uber, or in airport security check lines, will come up to you and they will sing this movement. They'll sing the opening of this, and they say, do you play that really pretty piece? Not realizing that what they're singing to me is the prelude from Suite Number 1 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach.
Baroque cellist Juliana Soltis with the prelude from the solo cello suite number 1 in G major of Johann Sebastian Bach. Juliana has stopped by in her whirlwind tour right now in Ohio. I know you were in Columbus a couple of days ago.
Yep.
You're going to be in Cleveland tomorrow night, actually, Friday evening. Tell us where you're going to be, just in case folks want to make the trek out there and see you in person.
I'm going to be performing at the Transformer Station, which is actually a small contemporary art museum in Cleveland. I'm really excited. It's a wonderful acoustic, and of course, there will be lots of really interesting art on display for guests to enjoy as well.
Yeah, and music that certainly goes with art. Listening to that, I mean, it sounds a little different than what I've heard before. What strikes me about some of this is I've always thought that Bach, was just a hair's breadth from jazz sometimes, and that sort of really comes alive in what you're doing with these cello suites, because there's an improvisatory element as well. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Our approach to Bach since the 19th century, and when I say the 19th century, I'm really thinking about what we call the Great Bach Revival. There are a couple other famous composer names associated with that. Brahms and Mendelssohn and Schumann really worked to publish the first collected edition of Bach's works and to bring his music back into the public consciousness, because in Bach's time, sort of once you were gone, that was it. People wanted what was new. And even in his own time, Bach was considered a little bit of an old-fashioned composer. We know that his sons thought that he was, kind of a stodgy old man,
My children feel the same way about
I suppose it's good to know some things never change.
Right.
Parents and children.
Yeah.
But in Bach's time, this music is a living art form, much like jazz. You go and you hear a jazz trio perform on 2 consecutive nights, and they could do the exact same set, and it's not going to sound the same. Bach's music, the music of any Baroque composer, is really meant to be played in that same vein, where every single time that you hear it, it's different, because every performer is going to, on this repeated material, add something that is unique to them. And certainly I played it one way in Columbus on Sunday night. I'm playing it one way today on Thursday morning, and I will play it another way tomorrow night and Friday evening. And I think it's exciting. it takes the works away from that realm of being sort of dusty museum pieces that we must venerate from a very safe, do not set off the alarms distance, and turns them into real living works of art with which we can feel free to engage on a very human level.
Yeah, and you make a good point about not necessarily striving as an artist and a performer for that perfect performance every time, right? That you see sort of etched in marble, as it were. Yours is living, it's breathing. You're trying to do something a little bit different. And you know, it may have been back in the day, well, certainly even before Bach's time, this cello was being played because it's older than Bach.
It is.
Which is a mind-blowing concept, I have to say. Just take a moment and introduce us to your cello.
Well, my first cello that I'm playing today, I call Grace. Social media post where I'm talking about, oh, Grace and I are stopping for a coffee in Duluth or something. I'm talking about my cello.
Good to know.
People are like, who is she traveling with?
Your imaginary friend, perhaps.
My imaginary friend. The only person brave enough to go on tour with me.
So Grace is your cello.
Grace is my cello, and Grace is an actual Baroque instrument. And when I say an actual Baroque instrument, I mean she is an instrument from the Baroque period, which of course went from 1600-ish to 1750. Those dates aren't exact. It's just a ballpark we give ourselves. And her label says 1677.
Wow.
Yeah. Now that date is disputed, as dates for instruments this old often are. But what is not disputed is the maker. And most people probably haven't heard of this particular violin maker. His name was Andreas Ferdinand Meyer. He's not as famous as Stradivarius or Amati. You know, there's no movies being made about him, no mystique about the instruments. But he has one very important claim to fame, and I wonder if you can guess it. He worked in Salzburg.
Oh, okay.
You can think
so
of
it has something
else.
to do with Mozart, I assume.
It does have something to do with Mozart. Andreas Ferdinand Meyer, in addition to making my cello, made the child Mozart's very first violin.
Oh,
yeah,
wow, that's a nice connection to have.
That is a nice connection.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the suite number 1. You're going to play another excerpt from it, I believe, the Courante, yes. And is there a little bit of improv involved in this piece as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I certainly improvised a little bit in the prelude, but that can be a little more challenging to detect unless you know the music really, really well. But when I start into the dance movements, and the Courante is one of the dance movements, here's where you're definitely going to hear the same material come back, and that's when you really want to like sort of prick up your ears and see if you can detect those ornaments.
Yeah. Cellist Juliana Soltis, music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Once again, here on Live from FM 91. From the first solo cello suite in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, we heard the Courant, performed here in our Dana Performance Studio by Baroque cellist Juliana Soltis. She is my guest today for Live from FM 91. Juliana has recorded all 6 of these solo Bach cello suites in her own inimitable style, I should say, and the wonderful cello that you brought in the studio this morning. The name of the album is called Going Off Script, the Ornamented Suites for cello. We've been talking about what that means today. But Juliana, tell us where folks can find you online if they're interested in the album.
Oh my goodness, there are a lot of options, which is kind of nice, about living in the digital age. You can find everything on my website, julianasoltismusic.com. But the album is sort of available from all of the usual suspects, including Amazon and iTunes, Apple Music, Spotify, if streaming is really your thing. And you can also buy physical copies of the album from cdbaby.com.
Yeah, I vote for the physical copy because I'm holding one right here, and it's quite a beautiful compilation that you have here, including a little booklet that goes with it. And one of the things that caught my eye in the booklet and that you mentioned to me in one of our previous conversations is this next piece that we're going to hear, these 2 minuets from that suite number 1 in G major, that you wanted to play the prelude when you were very young, but your teacher said you weren't ready, and then they put you onto these different minuets instead.
Yes.
Have I sort of followed that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Give us a little backstory on you. Now, when did you start playing the cello?
I started playing the cello when I was 9, which is a little on the later side. A lot of people I went to school with actually started when they were toddlers. But I started when I was 9 because there was a free program that was offered in the public schools where I grew up in South Charleston, West Virginia. And it's a partnership between the West Virginia Symphony and the Kanawha County Schools that thankfully continues to this day because it allows a lot of other children who wouldn't otherwise have this opportunity the chance to learn how to play a stringed instrument. And even if, like my brother, who is now a lawyer, working for the man, even he learned how to play the violin in the public schools. And I think that no child is ever the worse off for having that chance to learn how to express themselves through music. Yeah.
Well, in your case, obviously, you went and ran with it. But getting back to this story about the cello suites, now I imagine, as a budding cellist, that was one of the first things that you went straight toward was that prelude that we heard you play earlier. But your teacher said no.
She said no. I didn't know what it was. I just had heard the piece, and I thought that it was really pretty. And so I taught myself how to play the first couple of opening bars. And since I didn't know what the piece was, I went into my lesson, and I sat down, and I played those opening bars for my teacher. And I said, I want to play this. And not knowing, of course, that it's Bach, and that people talk about the Bach cello suites as being alternately the Mount Everest or the Mount Olympus of cello playing. And she says, you're not ready. It's to play that piece yet. And with, all the authority of an 11-year-old who has been playing the cello for all of 2 years in public schools, I insisted that I was. I really, really wanted to play this piece. I think like so many other people, it just connected with me on a very deep elemental level. And finally she said, okay, you can play Bach, but we're going to start with these minuets instead, because I suppose comparatively they're easier. The funny thing about Bach is the older you get, it doesn't really get easier. Right. You start to find more and more in it, and of course, refine your technique. And I think of technique just as kind of like a painter's palette. The more colors you have, the more beautiful things you can create. Yeah. But it never gets easier.
Okay, well, we'll turn it over to a little bit more music here. Returning now to that Suite Number 1 in G major, we're going to hear the Minuets 1 and 2. Again, Baroque cellist Juliana Soltis performing here on Live from FM 91. Baroque cellist Juliana Soltis performing the minuets from the Suite Number 1 in G major for solo cello, music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Juliana is with us for Live from FM 91, talking about Bach and those cello suites, and also her new album, which documents everything we've been listening to this morning. It's called Going Off Script, the Ornamented Suites for Cello. Now, there are hours of music here, and you're performing from memory, which is an extraordinary feat. I didn't mention that earlier, but it occurred to me while you were playing that there's no music involved. I guess the music's all in your head.
It does really sort of start to become part of you the more and more you play it. But I have to admit, before anybody thinks that this is a super cosmic feat I am achieving, I do actually have an eidetic memory. So it's a little bit
Explain
of
what
a
that
cheat.
means.
Oh, an eidetic memory is the technical term for what people perhaps have heard more commonly referred to as a photographic memory.
Okay.
So I remember whatever I see or whatever I hear.
Again, good to know.
Good to know. Well, it's very useful as a musician, although it means for me that when I'm preparing to do something like perform or for a recording, that I really do have to avoid other recordings to avoid internalizing too much somebody else's way of playing, which is a shame because there are so many wonderful Bach recordings out there. I'm a little embarrassed to even think about how many I own on everything from LP to CD.
But you have to divest yourself of all of those other interpretations in order to form your own.
Absolutely. Like somebody asked me once, do you ever listen to recordings? And I certainly do. Like when I'm thinking about a project, certainly a project like this where the material has been recorded a lot, I really want to know what everybody else has done. I talk in the booklet to the album a bit about my reticence to ever actually record the cello suites. I really didn't think it was something I was ever going to do, because so much has been said, and it has been said so well by my colleagues that I thought, I don't really want to make a Bach album unless I have something very specific to add to the conversation. So I'd spent a lot of time listening to Bach and just seeing what's out there before I ever got started.
Well, let me add to the list of your superpowers, besides the photographic memory and the virtuosic cello playing. Also, you have magnificent handwriting, which I know it makes its mark in the book here, the print booklet. Mm-hmm. But I know for a fact because you sent me a letter a while back.
I did.
And it was handwritten. And I was thinking, this can't be somebody's real handwriting. It's like calligraphy. I think they should make a font, right, out of your handwriting.
That has been suggested before, and since I had to do so much handwriting for the album, when my graphic designer Caleb Nye and I were playing with fonts, we couldn't find anything that we felt captured the spirit of the album. And with the booklet and with the physical product, we were really looking to create something that would be as much of an experience as the music itself and be as important to the person who chooses to interact with it as the recordings. And we're just like, all these what they call boxed fonts. We didn't like any of them. And I said, wait. And I did a little bit of just calligraphy on a scrap piece of paper, and I took a photo of it with my handy-dandy, never far from my side, smartphone. Right. And Caleb was like, that's it. And so once we really got into the album notes, and we thought we really want to make this handwriting something that ties the whole thing together and to give it that personal feeling. But having written out certain words so many times, because I often did multiple versions for Caleb to find the one that would work best with the page layout, I would appreciate it if somebody would create a font in my handwriting, just so that the next time I decide to do something like this, maybe my hand won't hurt so much from writing.
You'll never have to hand draw anything again or handwrite anything again. Well, just another reason to buy the physical album itself, which is beautifully designed. And beautifully played. I know you have, we've met Grace, your cello. Now, Grace's little sister, I assume, is sitting there next to her. Another cello you brought in to play this last piece of music. You want to introduce us to her?
Yeah, well, actually, this is Grace's little brother.
Oh, well, never mind.
Cellists, we can be so funny about this. I don't know that violinists and violists do this in quite the same way, but cellists, we often name our instruments. Maybe it's because they're person-sized and they take up a seat on the airplane, and sometimes Grace gets offered cocktails and snacks and things, which is always amusing. But Grace's little brother is Beater, and originally Beater's name was Beater, because when I found this cello, a friend of mine played it and looked at it and goes, "Oh, that's such a beater. I can't believe you bought that," meaning like a bad cello or a cello that was in bad shape. But when I found Beater, and I changed the name from Beater to Beater, because people got a little bit upset, and I thought, okay, just change a letter and it's suddenly better. When I found Beater, he was set up as a 4-string instrument, but I heard potential in the sound of this beat up little cello, and I thought, I'm going to take this instrument and I am going to take it to my luthier at the time, was Scott Smith in Seattle, and I asked him to convert it into a 5-stringed instrument. And you could say, well, why a 5-string cello, and why are you playing Bach on a 5-string cello? And there's one very, very good reason for that, which is that Bach told me to.
And you're not saying that he appeared to you as an apparition. You're saying these are the instructions that he left behind. Right?
I know. We're very, very close to Halloween, but no, Bach did not appear to me. I wish he had. I would have asked him all kinds of questions if he had. There's lots I'd love to know. But there's an indication at the beginning of the 6th suite in D major that says that this piece should be played on une violoncelle à 5 cordes. And what that means is a cello with 5 strings. And 5-string cellos are pretty rare in the 21st century. The cello that we see with the Cleveland Orchestra, or that you see in a chamber music concert here in Toledo, is a 4-stringed instrument. Yeah. But in Bach's time, there were many versions of the cello. There were many versions of cellos like Grace. They were often tuned differently, depending on what city you were in or what country you lived in. And there were also multiple versions of the 5-string cello. Beater is what's called a violoncello piccolo, and I love that name because violoncello means little bass violin, and piccolo makes things even smaller. So it's like the little bass violin. So you can't see Beater, but he's actually on the small side, probably a little more in line with a child's cello than with an adult cello. And there was another version of the 5-string cello called the violoncello da spalla. I love those. Yeah. It's the cello of the shoulder. And it's a smaller than Beater even cello, and it has a big leather strap like you'd see on an electric guitar. And you're supposed to sling this thing over your shoulder and play this cello on your shoulder. And the theory is that it was invented so that violinists and violists could play the cello, because who doesn't want to be a cellist?
That's right. All roads lead to the cello. It's fascinating, and I imagine it must have been a bit of an adjustment for you, though. Had you played a 5-string cello before, or did you learn it specifically for this kind of music?
I learned it specifically to play this suite. There's a sort of a misconception or an urban myth that this is the only piece for which anyone ever requires a 5-string cello. There are actually a lot of extant works from the Baroque period that ask for a 5-string cello of some sort. But I have never played any of those works. And so this was the first time that I really picked up a 5-string instrument in seriousness. And I thought, with all of the, surety and a little bit of arrogance that comes with having played the cello for almost 30 years now, that it was going to be a very simple thing to put down Grace and pick up this little 5-string instrument and just, rip away at some 6th suite. But the addition of the 5th string, and this is an E string that is added to the top of the instrument, so it's got the C, G, D, A like a normal cello, but then an E string on top like a violin. I thought this was going to be very, very easy. But adding that E string completely changes the tension dynamics of the instrument. And of course, that tension, the physics of sound, that's how we make sound at the cello. And it was not easy.
Yeah.
It was very humbling, to say the least. There was a good bit of sort of cursing and swearing that went on at my house while I was trying to learn this cello. And you and I had talked in my first album about a similar experience I had where I was bowing the cello underhanded for one piece. And I went back and forth for the longest time about whether I was really going to go through with it because I hated the sound so much. And finally realized that I was trying to impose an idea of sound onto this particular approach to playing the cello. And I came around to that same idea again with the 5-string cello, that, maybe you are trying too hard to make this cello, which is nothing like Grace, sound like Grace. And so once I started opening up my mind and my ears to this idea that it could be something completely different than any of the other 5 suites, wonderful things really started to happen.
Great. Well, I'm so anxious to hear an example now after all of that. This is from the Suite Number 6, which is for, as you mentioned, this type of cello, the 5-string cello. We're going to hear the jig from that, music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Baroque cellist Juliana Soltis and beater joining us here in the studio on Live from FM 91. Baroque cellist Juliana Soltis performing the Jig from the Suite Number 6 for solo cello in D major. That's music of J.S. Bach. And Juliana has spent time with us this morning talking about not only Bach and all this wonderful music, but also about her album, which contains all 6 of the suites for cello of Bach. It's called Going Off Script, the Ornamented Suites for Cello, available, as Juliana said, from all the usual suspects. You can find that online. Probably the best thing to do if you want to learn more about Juliana is just to Google her name, Juliana Soltis, Juliana Soltis. Juliana, I know you have a concert in Cleveland that's coming up tomorrow, Friday evening, and that's at, you said, Transformer Station?
At the Transformer Station.
Okay, so any folks listening out west of Toledo want to make the trek out, or out east, I should say, of Toledo, unless you want to make an extra long drive, head on over to Cleveland and catch Juliana's show. I know you have many more performances in the future for your tour of this wonderful album. But let me thank you, first of all, for making the time to stop in and share your art and artistry with us. It's been a fascinating conversation, wonderful performance, and we hope someday you'll come back and visit us again.
Oh, I'd love to. Next time I'm going to play in Toledo for sure.
Okay, definitely. You've been listening to Live from FM 91. I'm your host, Brad Cresswell, and our broadcast engineer today was Chris Pfeiffer, who also handled our production mixing this morning. Thanks for joining us today here on your public radio station, FM 91.